Welcome to Say More from Boston Globe Opinion. I'm Jim Dao, the editorial page editor. There used to be a saying, when the United States sneezes, the world catches a cold. But you could say that is true of China today. Its economy could well surpass the U.S. in a few years. So could its military. Even in AI and other tech industries, it is now rivaling the U.S. I've been listening closely to Trump when he's asked about China, and it seems impossible to know what he's thinking. He appointed China hawks to his team, but at a recent cabinet meeting, he had nothing but glowing words for the Chinese president, Xi Jinping.
I have a great relationship with President Xi. I've had a great relationship with him. I see so many things saying that we don't want China in this country. That's not right. We want them to invest in the United States. That's good. There's a lot of money coming in, and we'll invest in China. We'll do things with China. The relationship we'll have with China would be a very good one.
So what is happening between these two superpowers? Are we on a cusp of a new Cold War or some kind of warming relations? Thinking about this day and night is my friend and former colleague, Jane Perlez, who is the former Beijing bureau chief for the New York Times. She's a fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School where she makes a podcast. It's called Face Off, U.S. versus China, and it's now in its second season. Welcome, Jane.
Thank you, Jim. Very good to be here, especially in these crazy times.
So you were a correspondent and then ran the New York Times' Beijing bureau from 2012 to 2019. That now seems like a lifetime ago. Talk to me about what U.S.-China relations were like when you were working there.
Well, I like to put it this way, Jim. I started out in 2012 with all smiles on both sides, and I end up in 2019 with no smiles on either side, particularly no smiles on the Chinese side. So what do I mean by that? Just before I went out to Beijing, then Vice President Biden welcomed then Vice President Xi Jinping to the State Department. There was a big lunch on the 7th floor, and everybody who was anybody in China relations was there. And I was just going out to be the correspondent, and someone quite senior in the State Department was very nice and gave me a seat at a front table. So before we all sat down for lunch, there was meet and mingle. And Bob Zelek was there, the head of the World Bank. Henry Kissinger was there. The Chinese embassy was there in full regalia, the whole works. And everybody was smiling from ear to ear, and it wasn't because it was Valentine's Day 2012. It was because they thought that Xi Jinping was going to usher in a new era of what had gone before, friendly relations with Washington. They couldn't have been more wrong. And by the time I left in 2019, relations were in the tank.
Bring us up to date with Trump now. During his first term, his approach to China seemed maybe a little bit more belligerent than it is today. And maybe his relationship with President Xi was different. Talk about what he was like in his first term, and has he changed?
Look, to be honest with you, I don't think anybody knows what's going on in Donald Trump's mind vis-a-vis China today. What happened in the first administration? He put on tariffs, and there was a little tariff war. But the Chinese deflected him in a way by treating him like a prince. You know, on his trip to Beijing in 2018, they showed him around hidden parts of the Forbidden City. They showed him gold platters of the previous emperors, et cetera, and he came away quite flattered. Things did not proceed terribly well after that, and he had Peter Navarro and others on his staff who were big tariff people, and they did impose tariffs. But things weren't too bad. And this time, I think it's very hard to tell what's going to happen. Trump has left China alone fairly to a reasonable extent so far. He slapped on 2 sets of 10% tariffs, but that's mild compared to Canada and Mexico. People think he's waiting for what he sees as a grand deal, but what that grand deal might be, who knows? And who knows if he knows?
I'm curious about the people he's surrounded himself with. You mentioned Peter Navarro. There certainly were any number of what I think you could call China hawks around him in the first administration. I'm not entirely clear if that's true this time around. You certainly have Marco Rubio, who seems pretty hawkish on China.
But has no power.
But has no power. And then you have Elon Musk, who's got all kinds of investments in China and has apparently lots of power. What's going on there? What kind of conflicts are happening in the inner circle around him? And where do you think it might end up?
I mean, I think nobody in their right mind would honestly want to predict. On the one hand, you read very well-informed China correspondent Ling Ling Wei in the Wall Street Journal this morning. She was expelled in 2020, but she writes very knowledgeably from New York about China, and she says, secretly the Chinese government or the leadership is very worried and very nervous about Trump. You speak to other people, Chinese people who are in Beijing at think tanks, and they're fairly confident because they think that Trump's just going to make a mess of everything, and they're ready, lying low, not doing anything too much yet, but they're ready to pick up the pieces. And you can see already that Trump has alienated Europe big time, and that leaves an opening for Xi Jinping to go and try and make friends in Europe where he hasn't had much success so far, but he may be quite successful now.
Circling back again to Trump, so he had this blow up with Zelensky recently. And, one sort of fair but maybe completely naive analysis of what's going on with Trump's embrace of Putin is that this is his way of detaching Russia from China and isolating China. Something that I think in your podcast you've referred to as the reverse Nixon effect, right? Do you see it that way? What do you think is going on here? And do you think there is, Trump is actually following sort of a reverse Nixon policy of trying to separate Russia from China, to isolate China?
I think it's a fool's errand, and I think most people who know China think that it's Trump is dreaming if he's going to try and separate these two countries. When people say they're referring to a reverse Nixon, what happened in 1972 is that Nixon went to China and brought China on the side of the United States and was able to do so. Why? Because China and Russia and the Soviet Union then were at each other's necks. They were fighting. In fact, the Soviets were threatening to drop tactical nuclear weapons on the Chinese in 1969.
Right.
So that made it easy to separate them. It's entirely different now. The two communist leading countries in the world, China and Russia, are very friendly. Now, there are disagreements, and maybe they won't stay together forever. And the other thing is that China's now the dominant partner, is far, far richer than Russia. In 1972, China was a poor agrarian society. Soviet Union had the upper hand in a military way.
Right.
Today, it's the other way around. China is much more powerful militarily, economically, in every single way. And they're helping Russia to keep the Ukraine war going. It's just different circumstances. And what does Trump get by allying himself with Russia, which is a nothing burger economy? What does he get?
Do you think that he has a working theory on China?
I have no idea. People keep saying this. I would pay you $1 million to anybody who understands what Trump is going to do tomorrow morning.
Yeah.
There's no way of knowing.
It's all transactional, day-to-day, reactive sort of politics.
Look, he's a New York real estate guy. I knew him back in the 70s. And as a matter of fact, we lived in the same building. And I don't think he's changed much. He knows land, he knows money to buy land, and that's how he's acting with Canada, Mexico, Greenland. And that's his way of thinking.
Yeah.
It's a real estate foreign policy.
Well, I've been thinking about his focus on Canada and Mexico, and Greenland as well, and Denmark along with it, and even Ukraine, Russia to some degree. He's focused his initial weeks on these countries, several of which are our allies, and he's been incredibly hostile and bullying towards them. Meanwhile, the big force in the world, China, he's barely talked about except to impose, a couple rounds of tariffs, right? And I'm curious what you think about that sequencing of his priorities? Like, why is he not talking about China the way he once said he was going to focus on China? Is what's going on there? Is it because he doesn't know what to do about China? Is it because he's a little bit of afraid of China?
I think it's impossible to know. I think he's probably afraid of China. Do you know, China has a bigger navy than the United States.
Yeah.
China is building nuclear weapons faster than you and I can talk. They're dominating the EV market. They're dominating the solar panel market. It's a different China to when Obama was president or even when Biden was president, and he's got to deal with it. Though albeit, I will say, the Chinese are having difficulties with their economy, and their economy is in a slump. And the real estate market is down, and consumers are very nervous because the values of their apartments have gone down, and they're not opening up their pocketbooks as they've been directed to do by Xi Jinping. There's an estimated 25% unemployment among the under 25-year-olds. Feminist women are unhappy. Very rich people are unhappy. They're going to live other places. So the head of ByteDance, which is the controlling company of TikTok, now lives in Singapore in some kind of self-exile because he doesn't want to become a creature of the regime. Jack Ma, the king of their tech titans, lives outside of the country most of the time. So I don't know. Maybe Trump thinks he can wait until China's economy gets worse. It's not clear. I think the Chinese, though, are being quite smart. They're waiting. They're not doing anything terribly much because they just want to see what he's going to do. And if you listen to some of them, hope to pick up the pieces after the mess that Trump has made.
More of my conversation with Jane Perlez after a short break. Jane, you mentioned in one of your podcasts that there are something like 300,000 Chinese students studying at American universities and only about 8,000 Americans studying at Chinese universities, which makes me think that Americans really don't have a very deep understanding about Chinese culture or politics or language, certainly. What in particular do you think Americans fail to understand about China?
Everything. I'll give you an illustration. So I had a few people around to dinner in New York a couple of weeks ago. These are publishing people, film people, people of the world, people I've known for years and years, who I think have always been a little puzzled by my interest in China. So in the middle of the conversation, an dear friend of mine said, "Oh, and does China have nuclear weapons?" So this is a very basic misunderstanding that China is a peer competitor. There's no way of getting around it, especially when it has 1.4 billion people. I keep saying it's got a navy bigger than the American Navy.
Yeah.
That's just a few of the barometers.
Well, conversely, my sense is that the Chinese have a much better understanding of us than we do.
That's because they're very diligent about understanding the rest of the world. They have whole departments of universities and of course the foreign ministry that is devoted to various parts of the world. And I can guarantee you that as we speak, there are people in Beijing associated with the Politburo, with the Standing Committee, which is the top 7 men who rule the country, who are studying everything that is coming out of Washington, not only from the White House and not only from the Treasury, but from the think tanks, from everywhere.
Yeah.
They just inundate themselves with this material. And then on the basis of that, they make some decisions, or at least they make some recommendations, and one man makes a decision.
But even so, even with all that sort of base of knowledge and many, many, many people who have some contact with America or have studied here or know the language well, what did they get wrong about us, or about Americans at least, do you think?
Well, I don't know about the elites, but I will say this. The propaganda machine in China is incredibly effective. It's all saturation, and I think it's very effective in painting the United States as a competitor that is out to keep China down, which is not actually incorrect.
When you were bureau chief in Beijing, I believe you had 10 reporters under you. Now there are only 2 New York Times reporters in this vast country. And a lot of other Western news organizations are in the same boat. So what is the consequence of so few Western reporters in China? How has that affected our understanding of the place?
Well, in many ways, but I think fundamentally it's important that we have reporters on the ground in any country, but particularly China, and in China to understand the fundamental equation between the government and the people. And basically that equation has been that we, the government, will give you wherewithal and a good living standard, and then you support us unquestionably. So to me, the most interesting thing at the moment is, given the downturn in the economy, given the housing crisis, given the pressure on China from the United States, how is that equation, how is that understanding, how is it, how firm is it? Is there any disintegration of support for the regime? And I don't think we have a good sense of that. I suspect it's still probably pretty solid, but it's hard to tell. And even if you are a reporter on the ground there, I think it's hard to tell also because, don't forget, the surveillance is very intense, incredibly intense. And so it's very difficult to know what people are thinking. And if you do get a sense of what people are thinking, it's then very difficult to translate that into reliable stories. But there's no question that it's far better to have reporters on the ground than not. It's a big disadvantage not having people there.
Tell us a little bit about how you got interested in China. You've been a correspondent all over the world, literally, and China was, I guess, really your last stop. But was it always a place of fascination for you?
Well, it's sort of a state secret because I don't like to admit it. But I went to China during the Cultural Revolution before Americans could go.
Oh.
I was an Australian university student, and we went. There were 50 of us, and we were all, different kinds of politics. And it was just a revelation to see a country in turmoil and very poor. But you could feel even there and then that it was huge and dynamic and important.
Yeah.
And soon after that, I came to the United States and lived in the United States. And you could see that this was going to be the competition of the century or more. So it was very obvious what was going to happen.
It must have been breathtaking to go back in 2012 to see what the country was like after all those years.
Well, I don't know that it was breathtaking. I'll tell you a funny story. In between foreign assignments, I covered the State Department. And so I went to China with Colin Powell when he was Secretary of State it must have been early 2001. He had a little press conference in Beijing for the State Department reporters and Chinese reporters who were traveling with him. And he said, "Oh, I've never seen anything like this. Look at this skyline. It's bigger than the skyline in Virginia around the Pentagon." And I felt like saying to him, "Where have you been? It's been like this for 15 years. I mean, I had been going back to China. And, the Americans just keep their heads in the sand."
Yeah, even the Secretary of State. So this has all been fairly sort of disheartening about U.S.-China relations. But how pessimistic are you about where we're going in this global dance?
Well, I wish I could be more hopeful. And I do think there is reason that the United States has to be prepared for a well-armed, economically strong China. And I'll give you an illustration of, how that might turn out. In our first season of our podcast, U.S. versus China, we had an episode about an incident in 2001, which is a long time ago, about how a United States surveillance plane, a spy plane, was flying in international waters off China and was hit by a Chinese fighter jet. And the Chinese fighter jet sank with a pilot on board and he was killed. But through some very fantastic piloting, the American spy plane managed to land in China with 26 people on board. Now, those people were held for something like 21 days, but they were let go because of very good diplomacy on both sides. If that happened today, it would never end that happily. First of all, the Americans would never land on Chinese territory because they would be too fearful that the crew would not be released.
Right.
And anyway, maybe they couldn't get to Chinese territory. It would be highly likely that the American plane, if it was struck, would sink into the South China Sea. Then what would happen? There would be a race to the crash site. And what would happen then? The Chinese would probably get their almost entirely probable would get there fastest because they've got more ships in the area, faster ships. And then what happens? It could be really, really dangerous. And diplomacy may not work in that situation. Yeah. So that's just a little example of what's possibly ahead.
Each of your podcast episodes are on totally different topics, and it's making me think there is so much more for the U.S. news consumer to understand about China. Can you make the case for why our listeners should be paying closer attention to China? Why is it important to follow this now, do you think?
I think that China is the most important player in the world aside from the United States. And I think they're headed for some turbulent times. And I think we should all be prepared for those turbulent times and to have a broader understanding than they are bad and we are good. And that we should be able to have rational discussions about maybe there's some kind of way that we can live together. Now, for example, the United States has been the primary power in Asia-Pacific for more than 70 years, and China is challenging that very severely. And some people would say the United States and China are both peers in Asia-Pacific. And I think that's something that we need to understand, and that our allies, Japan and South Korea, where we have troops stationed, may not be able to keep those troops there forever and a day. Maybe they'll want to go nuclear. There are many things that could change in the Asia-Pacific region because of China's power and our distraction or our policies. And I think we need to look closely and to understand all facets of China, not just the Communist Party and its rule.
Jane Perlez is the former Beijing bureau chief for the New York Times. She is now a fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School, where she makes the podcast Face Off, U.S. versus China. It's supported by the Carnegie Corporation. It's terrific. It covers everything from movies to U.S.-China relations to journalism China. I highly recommend it, and listen to the first season as well. Thanks, Jane.
Thank you, Jim. Pleasure to be here.
Say More is a production of the Boston Globe. Today's episode was produced by Anna Kusmer. Our engineer is Uzair Ahmed. If you like the show, please follow us and leave us a review on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can email us at saymore@globe.com. I'm Jim Dao. Thanks for listening.